There is a question that has haunted this case since the moment it broke open in the summer of 2018. Not what happened. The world knows what happened, not when it happened. The timeline has been reconstructed, verified, and examined by investigators, journalists, and forensic analysts across years of documented review. The question, the one that has never been fully or honestly answered, is why. Why does a man wake up in the early hours of a Monday morning, move through the hallway of his own home, past the bedroom doors of his sleeping children, and make a set of decisions so catastrophic, so irreversible, so incomprehensible, that 6 years of confessions have still not produced a complete explanation? Chris Watts sat in courtrooms. He sat across from federal and state investigators in prison interview rooms. He wrote letters. He gave multiple confessions across multiple years in multiple formats. And across every word he ever produced about that night, he never delivered a coherent, complete, and fully honest account of why he did what he did. Not once. But here's what most coverage of this case has never done. Most coverage looked for the answer in a single confession, a single motive, a single moment. The answer was never buried in one place. It was scattered across years of financial records, social media videos, forensic psychological research, court documents, investigative interviews released to the public, and letters written from inside a prison cell. When those pieces are assembled together and examined as a complete picture, what emerges is not a mystery. It is a documented, deeply disturbing portrait of how an ordinary man, through years of silence, shame, and deliberate disconnection, arrived at the most extraordinary act of destruction imaginable. What you are about to hear is not speculation. It is not theory. Every claim in this narration is drawn from documented, publicly available records, court filings, autopsy reports, investigative interviews, financial records, and forensic psychological analysis. And by the time this is over, you will understand this case in a way that most coverage has never come close to achieving. If this is the kind of depth you have been looking for in true crime, you are already in the right place. This is True Crime Dav, the channel that goes all the way to the bottom of every case. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every video on this channel operates exactly at this level, and you do not want to miss a single one. To understand what Chris Watts did and why he did it, you have to understand what his life actually looked like. Not the version broadcast to the world, but the one he woke up inside every single day. From the outside, the picture was everything the American dream promises. A 5-bedroom home in the quiet subdivision of Windham Hill in Frederick, Colorado. 2 small daughters with bright eyes and wide smiles. A 3rd child on the way. A husband and wife who appeared in every photograph and every shared video to be exactly where they wanted to be. Shanann Watts was magnetic. She was passionate, relentlessly energetic, and genuine in the way that very few public personalities manage to sustain. Her Facebook live videos attracted thousands of regular viewers. She talked about her family, her business, her daily life with an authenticity that felt real because, for her, it was. She documented everything. Family dinners, doctor visits, her oldest daughter, Bella, reciting poems. Her younger daughter, Celeste, known to everyone as CEC, refusing to say goodbye to the camera at the end of every broadcast because she was not finished talking to the audience yet. Shanann talked about the Thrive patches she wore on her arm, the supplements she took each morning, the lifestyle she was building through her work as an independent promoter for the health and wellness company Level. She talked about her girls. She talked about her husband. She talked about the future she was building, with visible, genuine commitment. And Chris stood in the background of those videos, quiet, smiling when the moment required it, nodding when his name came up, holding the children when the frame called for it. From every external angle, he looked like a devoted husband and a proud father, a man who had built something worth keeping and knew it. But the camera never showed what was sitting on the kitchen counter. It never showed the mortgage statements. It never showed the final notices or the credit card balances that were not being resolved. It never showed the quiet, steady accumulation of financial pressure that had been building in that house for years before August of 2018. In June of 2015, Chris and Shanann Watts filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the District of Colorado. The filing disclosed significant unsecured debts, credit cards, medical bills, personal loans, alongside their primary mortgage on the Saratoga Trail home. Medical expenses had been substantial. Shanann had been diagnosed with systemic lupus erythematosus and fibromyalgia, both chronic conditions requiring ongoing treatment and medication. The bankruptcy discharged a portion of their unsecured debt, but the mortgage remained. And within 3 years of that discharge, by the summer of 2018, the household finances were heading toward the same cliff again. The Windham Hill Homeowners Association had filed a lawsuit against them for unpaid dues. The mortgage was in arrears. Credit cards were carrying balances that were not being addressed. And Shanann, now 15 weeks pregnant with a son she and Chris had already named Nico, was still filming videos every day, still posting updates, still presenting a life that appeared to be moving steadily forward. For Shanann, those videos were not performance in any cynical sense. They were her business platform, her creative outlet, her community, and her livelihood. Her income as a Level promoter depended on personal sales volume, on recruiting new promoters into her network, and on maintaining a social media presence that made the Thrive lifestyle look aspirational and achievable. The camera was the mechanism through which she fought for her family's financial future. She believed in what she was building. The energy she brought to every broadcast was genuine. She was not pretending. She was fighting. But for Chris, something entirely different was happening inside every one of those videos. Every comment from a viewer calling them couple goals was a quiet indictment. Every share, every view, every public declaration of happiness that did not match what he felt in private added another layer to a shame he was already buried under and had no framework for addressing. He mowed the lawn. He drove the girls to school. He commuted to the remote oil well sites of Weld County and operated equipment for Anadarko Petroleum in silence for hours at a stretch. He came home. He smiled for the camera when asked. He said nothing about any of it to anyone who might have helped him find a different way forward. He absorbed it, compressed it, and stored it somewhere unreachable inside himself, and he kept performing. Investigators, forensic psychologists, and behavioral analysts who examined this case after the fact identified a specific and consistent psychological profile in Chris Watts, one that, once understood, reframes nearly everything that followed. He was, by every account from people who knew him across different periods of his life, deeply people-pleasing, aggressively conflict-avoidant, and fundamentally incapable of expressing emotional distress in any direct or honest way. Friends and family described the same pattern going back years. Shanann led. Chris followed. She made decisions about the household, the children's schedules, the finances, the content, the direction of their shared life. He deferred. He agreed. He accommodated. He chose the path of least resistance every single time. Not because Shanann forced him into that position, but because his own psychological architecture gave him no other default. Shanann Watts was not a malicious or controlling person. She was assertive, organized, and driven, a woman who knew what she wanted and pursued it with extraordinary energy. But in a marriage where one partner is continuously expanding and the other is continuously shrinking, something eventually gives. And Chris Watts had been shrinking for years, silently, steadily, without ever once saying so out loud to another living person. Forensic psychologists who study the phenomenon of family annihilation, a recognized category within criminological and psychological research, referring to the murder of an entire family unit by a family member, most commonly the husband and father, consistently identify one defining characteristic that appears across virtually every documented case. It is not rage. It is not hatred toward the victims. It is not cruelty in the conventional or theatrical sense. What researchers find, case after documented case, is a profound and accumulated loss of personal identity. A man who no longer knows who he is outside the role he has been assigned. A man who, rather than doing the painful but survivable work of confronting his own collapse and reaching for help, instead erases the circumstances he associates with feeling lost. The family annihilator is not typically the explosive, volatile personality. He does not have a documented history of violence or a prior record of instability. He is far more often the quiet one, the agreeable one, the man the neighbors described as polite, the co-workers described as easy to work with, the family described as the last person anyone would ever suspect. Chris Watts fit that description with precision. He was not a cinematic villain. He was something far more ordinary. And precisely because of that, something far more dangerous. By the summer of 2018, the financial picture inside the Watts household had become untenable. The mortgage on a home that had been purchased at a price the family could not comfortably sustain was again falling behind. Chris's salary from Anadarko Petroleum provided a steady but insufficient foundation. Shanann's Thrive income was commission-based and variable. Strong months existed, but the inconsistency made long-term financial planning nearly impossible. The HOA lawsuit was active. A third child was weeks away from requiring additional medical costs, childcare expenses, and an entirely new layer of financial obligation on a structure that was already beyond its capacity. Rational responses to that combination of pressures exist and are survivable. Financial counseling, marital counseling, honest conversation between partners about restructuring their lives, consultation with a bankruptcy attorney about available options. But Chris Watts was not operating as a psychologically healthy person in the summer of 2018. He was operating as a man for whom financial failure was not a practical problem to be solved. It was an existential statement about who he was. He had been raised in a working-class household in North Carolina. His sense of self-worth was directly and profoundly tied to his ability to provide. The idea of being seen as a man who could not sustain his household, who had already survived one bankruptcy and was heading toward the same disaster again, was not something he processed as a manageable challenge. It was something he experienced as proof of fundamental inadequacy. And for a man whose entire psychological architecture was constructed around avoiding shame and never asking for help, that proof was intolerable. Consider what divorce would have meant for a man in that specific psychological position. Child support for 2 children, soon to be 3. Legal fees he had no capacity to absorb. The loss of a house that may have been worth less than what was owed on it. The public dissolution of a marriage that had been broadcast to thousands of people online. His name permanently attached to financial ruin and marital collapse. Every piece of it visible, documented, and irreversible. In his distorted internal framework, divorce was not a resolution. It was an amplification of everything he was most ashamed of. It was the thing that would make every failure visible at once. And so he did not pursue it. He did not sit Shanann down and tell her the marriage was not working, that he was struggling, that he needed something different. He said nothing. And then he said nothing again. And then again. Until saying nothing was no longer an option. But by the time that moment arrived, the alternative he had constructed was infinitely worse than anything honesty could have produced. In the spring of 2018, Chris Watts began a romantic and sexual relationship with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger. She worked as an environmental operations coordinator for a contracting company that performed consulting and monitoring work at Anadarko Petroleum well sites, which is how their professional paths intersected. Almost every media account of this case identifies the affair as the motive, frames Kessinger as the reason, and moves on. That framing is incomplete. What Nicole Kessinger represented to Chris Watts was not simply another woman. She was a second identity. She was living evidence of a version of himself he had long since stopped believing was accessible. Think carefully about who Chris Watts had become inside his marriage by that point. He was the background prop. The man who nodded on cue, smiled for the camera, failed quietly at providing, and watched his pregnant wife broadcast their life to strangers, while he sank beneath the surface of a life he no longer recognized as his own. Now consider who he was with Kessinger. She had no knowledge of the debt. She did not know about the bankruptcy. She had no awareness that the house was in arrears, that the credit cards were unresolved, that a baby was due in months. To her, he was simply a quiet man, calm, attentive, physically present, emotionally uncomplicated. He did not feel like a failure in her company. He felt new. He felt seen not as a husband, not as a father, not as a provider who was failing at his primary function, not as a prop in someone else's business, but as a person worth choosing. Investigators later confirmed through extensive interviews conducted after the murders that Nicole Kessinger had no knowledge that Chris was still fully and actively married, living at home with 2 young children and a pregnant wife. He had told her he was in the process of separating. She believed him. When she learned the truth in the days following the disappearances, she contacted law enforcement immediately, cooperated completely, surrendered her phone records and text messages without hesitation, and was ultimately cleared of any prior knowledge or involvement by investigators. She was, by every evidentiary measure, another person deceived by Chris Watts. Forensic psychologists who have studied this case and others with comparable profiles identify a specific psychological state they call fantasy replacement. It is the moment when the imagined life, the clean life, the unencumbered life, the life without consequences, becomes more psychologically real to a person than the actual life they inhabit. Chris Watts was not simply conducting an affair. He was rehearsing an escape. He was mentally inhabiting a parallel world in which the debt had disappeared. The pregnancy had not occurred. The cameras were off, and he was someone worth becoming. The more time he spent inside that parallel world, the more the real world, Shanann, the girls, the mortgage, the obligations, the identity he had never fully chosen, felt less like a life and more like an obstacle. By late July and into August of 2018, Kessinger was asking direct questions. When was the separation actually happening? Why was Shanann still in contact with him? When would things concretely move forward? Chris had no answers, because in the real world, nothing had moved forward at all. He had not told Shanann the marriage was over. He had not consulted an attorney. He had taken no concrete step in any direction. He was living simultaneously in 2 worlds, and both of them were closing in. There is a video, documented, public, and almost impossible to watch now, of Bella Watts standing in front of a camera, 4 years old, her hair pulled back, her small hands folded in front of her, reciting a poem about her father. She said with complete and unguarded sincerity that her daddy was a hero, that he helped her grow up strong, that he read her books and tied her shoes. That little girl loved her father without condition, without reservation, without any awareness of anything other than the man who kissed her goodnight and held her hand and was, in her small uncertain world, someone safe. Chris Watts killed her. He killed her in the early hours of a Monday morning, inside a home where she had only ever felt protected. And then he carried her body to a remote oil site and placed it inside a crude oil storage tank through an opening 8 inches in diameter. She was 4 years old. How does a man arrive at that? How does a father, a man who was, by all documented evidence, once genuinely present with his children, who held them during family videos and participated in bedtime routines and appeared in photographs as a parent who was there, how does that man become capable of this? The answer is not sudden. And the gradual nature of it is precisely what makes it so deeply disturbing to examine. In the early years of fatherhood, the video record confirms that Chris was emotionally present. He held Cece. He played with the girls. He was there not only physically, but in the way that matters. But as the marriage deteriorated, as financial pressure accumulated, as his sense of self eroded month by month, he withdrew from his children the same way he withdrew from everything else that required emotional labor, slowly, quietly, without confrontation, without a single direct conversation about what was happening inside him. He was still physically present in the house. He still appeared in photographs. He still kissed them goodnight. But the emotional connection thinned to something nearly unrecognizable. Forensic psychologists who study family annihilation identify a process they describe as dehumanization by association. It is not that the perpetrator develops hatred toward his children as individuals. It is that, within his fractured and increasingly dissociated psychological framework, his children have become inseparable from the life he is desperately trying to escape. They are no longer experienced as separate human beings with their own futures, their own needs, their own irreplaceable right to exist. They are experienced as components of the trap, the obligation, the cost, the reason the fantasy can never become reality. Bella and Cece were, in Chris Watts's distorted internal world, the reason Kessinger's questions would eventually become unanswerable. They were the reason divorce would financially bury him. They were the reason the life he had built inside his imagination would never translate into the life he actually inhabited. They had been reclassified, not through any single decision, but through the slow accumulation of emotional withdrawal and deliberate disconnection from daughters into obstacles. This is not an attempt to make what he did understandable in any moral sense. It is a documentation of exactly how a man arrives at something that has no moral frame capable of containing it. He did not become this person overnight. He became this person through months and years of choosing his own psychological comfort over the humanity of the children in front of him. In early August of 2018, Shanann traveled to Scottsdale, Arizona for a Lavelle business conference. She had spent much of the summer physically separated from Chris. The girls had been staying in North Carolina with her family, the Rusheks, for an extended visit. During those weeks of separation, Shanann confided to close friends, including her longtime friend, Nicole Atkinson, that something felt profoundly wrong at home. She described Chris as emotionally absent, cold, and unrecognizable. She said he felt like a different person. She told friends that during one of their conversations, he had told her he was no longer sure he wanted the baby. That disclosure devastated her. She did not know about Nicole Kessinger. She had no awareness that while she was away, Chris had been spending his evenings and weekends building an entirely separate emotional life. Phone records and digital evidence recovered during the investigation confirmed that Chris sent thousands of text messages to Kessinger during this period, many of them late at night, while Shanann was attempting to reach him from across the country. He searched the internet for secluded destinations to visit with Kessinger. He researched jewelry. He drove with her to the Great Sand Dunes National Park. He visited a car museum with her. He did all of this while Shanann was mailing him books about emotional connection and marriage, at least one of which, investigators later confirmed, was found in the trash. Shanann flew home on the night of the 12th of August. Her flight from Arizona was delayed, and she did not arrive back at the Saratoga Trail House until the early hours of the 13th of August. Nicole Atkinson drove her from Denver International Airport. A neighbor's doorbell camera captured Shanann walking to the front door of her home at approximately 1:48 in the morning. She was 15 weeks pregnant. She was exhausted. She was coming home to a man she already knew had fundamentally changed, and she still had no idea how deep that change went. Chris was inside. Bella and CECE were asleep in their rooms. What happened in that house between the moment Shanann crossed the threshold and the moment Chris left for work has been reconstructed only through his own accounts that have shifted, contradicted themselves, and evolved through multiple tellings across multiple years. What is confirmed through autopsy findings, physical evidence, and Chris Watts's own admissions across successive interviews is this. Shanann Watts died by manual strangulation. Her death required sustained, deliberate physical force maintained over a period of minutes. The unborn child she was carrying, the son she and Chris had named Nico, died with her. Bella Marie Watts was 4 years old. Celeste Catherine Watts was 3 years old. Both girls died from smothering. Bella's autopsy, as documented in the official medical examiner's report, revealed bite marks on the inside of her cheek and tongue, physical evidence that she was conscious and resisting during the act that killed her. She fought for her life. Chris loaded the bodies and drove approximately 40 miles east to Cervi Ranch 319, a remote Anadarko petroleum well site in rural Weld County that he accessed regularly as part of his assigned work rotation. Shanann was buried in a shallow grave near the oil battery equipment. Bella and Cece were placed separately inside crude oil storage tanks through 8-inch diameter access hatches at the top of each unit. He then continued through the remainder of his workday, as though nothing had occurred. By mid-morning on the 13th of August, Shanann had missed a scheduled obstetrics appointment, something entirely out of character for a woman who maintained meticulous prenatal care. Nicole Atkinson could not reach her by phone. Growing alarmed, she drove to the house and found no sign of Shanann's departure. The family vehicle was in the driveway. Shanann's phone, purse, keys, and lupus medication were all inside. Shanann could not and would not have left voluntarily without any of those things. Nicole called the Frederick Police Department and requested a welfare check. Officer Scott Kuntz responded. Chris was contacted and returned from the worksite. He was cooperative, calm, and apparently confused by his wife's absence. The following afternoon, the 14th of August, Chris agreed to an on-camera interview with a reporter from Denver's KMJHD television station. He stood on the porch of the family home and looked directly into the camera. He said his children's smiles lit up his world. He said the previous night had been traumatic because he kept expecting to hear them run through the door. He said he was being torn apart. He performed grief with the same quiet, practiced composure he had used to perform contentment for years. The mechanism was identical. Only the content had changed. On the 14th of August, federal and state investigators administered a polygraph examination at the Frederick Police Department. Chris Watts failed it comprehensively. The post-polygraph interrogation, conducted by Colorado Bureau of Investigation agent Tammy Lee and FBI agent Graham Coder, eventually produced his first confession, a fabricated one. He claimed that he had observed Shanann strangling the girls on a baby monitor and had reacted by strangling Shanann in a rage. Investigators did not believe this account, and it was not supported by any physical evidence. But it accomplished one critical thing. It placed the children at the oil site and gave investigators a location. On August 15, 2018, Chris Watts was formally arrested. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy under Colorado statute, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The bodies of Shanann, Bella, and CECE were recovered from Cervi Ranch 319 on the 16th of August, after Chris provided the location during continued interrogation. He never went to trial. In November of 2018, the Rushek family, Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra, and her brother Frankie, made a formal request to the Weld County District Attorney's Office. They did not want the death penalty pursued. They did not want their grief extended across the length of a capital trial. They wanted the process closed. District Attorney Michael Rourke honored that request. A plea agreement was reached. On November 6, 2018, in Weld County District Court, Chris Watts entered guilty pleas to every count filed against him. He said the word guilty, individually, to each charge as it was read aloud. On November 19, 2018, Judge Marcelo Kopkow sentenced him. From the bench, the judge stated that in 17 years as a judicial officer across thousands of cases, he could say objectively that this was perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime he had ever handled. He sentenced Chris Watts to 5 consecutive life terms without any possibility of parole. Chris Watts will die in prison. He will never live a single day of the life he destroyed his family to obtain. After sentencing, he did not go silent. Across multiple years, in multiple formats, he continued to speak. And in the speaking, he revealed things incrementally, never completely, always in ways shaped more by his own psychological needs than by any genuine commitment to honesty. In February of 2019, agents Lee and Coder traveled to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, where Chris had been transferred, and conducted a 5-hour recorded interview. In this session, he revised his account substantially. He admitted that he, not Shanann, had killed the children. He acknowledged that his earlier claim about Shanann harming the girls was entirely fabricated. He described what happened during the drive to Cervi Ranch 319. He admitted that Bella was awake in the vehicle. He stated that she asked him whether the same thing that had happened to her mother was going to happen to her. He described what occurred at the site. He described placing each child's body through the access hatch of the storage tanks. He delivered these details in a tone that investigators who reviewed the recording described as disturbingly flat, calm, cooperative, almost clinical, notable primarily for what was absent from it. In 2019, he participated in conversations with representatives of a prison ministry with whom he had developed a relationship. In those exchanges, he reframed the murders in spiritual terms, describing himself as having been in a dark place, as having been deceived in some spiritual sense, as being a fundamentally different person now from the one who had committed those acts. Forensic psychologists who reviewed the available material noted consistently that the language was rehearsed, the emotional display was performative, and the framing, positioning himself as someone spiritually compromised rather than someone who had made a sequence of deliberate and irreversible choices, was a continuation of the self-serving narrative management that had characterized his conduct from the beginning. Then, in 2020 and 2021, letters surfaced. Chris had been corresponding with a pen pal, a woman who had initiated contact after his incarceration. In those letters, he disclosed things he had never stated in any official interview or formal legal proceeding. He wrote that he had been planning the murders for several weeks before the 13th of August, directly contradicting his framing of that morning as the result of a conversation that escalated beyond his control. He wrote that he had attempted to smother the girls inside the house before loading them into the vehicle, and that the initial attempt was unsuccessful because one or both children woke. He wrote that Bella saw him with Shanann's body. He wrote that Cece asked what was wrong with Mommy. He disclosed these things to a stranger in private correspondence, because the pattern across 6 years of varying accounts had been entirely consistent. The more official the setting, the more controlled and sanitized the story. The more private the context, the more the truth surfaced. Investigators who have tracked the full arc of his statements remain skeptical that a complete and fully honest account has ever been delivered. The incremental release of information, shaped always by audience and context, has never coalesced into a single coherent, unmanaged truth. What this case ultimately documents is not a mystery about what happened. It is a documented portrait of how a man who was never honest, never brave enough to face his own failures, and never willing to ask for help constructed the conditions for catastrophe across years of small, quiet choices. He was not a man who snapped. He was a man who eroded, slowly, silently, across 1,000 consecutive moments of avoidance, shame, and suppression. The debt did not make him a killer. The marriage did not make him a killer. The affair did not make him a killer. But each of those things contributed a layer to a cage built entirely from the inside, from his own refusal to be honest, his own refusal to be vulnerable, his own refusal to do the hard and uncomfortable work of confronting reality and asking for a different outcome. Financial shame felt more unbearable to him than financial reality. A fantasy felt more real to him than his daughters' faces. Fatherhood had become, in his experience, weight rather than purpose. And he had chosen, incrementally and deliberately, to let it remain that way. The cage he felt imprisoned in was never the house, never the marriage, never the children, or the debt, or the cameras. The cage was himself. And rather than recognize that, rather than find the courage to dismantle it through honesty and accountability, he destroyed the people who had lived inside it with him. Judge Kopkow said from the bench that he did not expect a full and truthful account would ever be delivered, and that even if it were, no rational person could accept those reasons as a justification for what was done. He sentenced Chris Watts to spend the remainder of his life in a concrete cell. And in that cell, Chris Watts lives every day with the outcome of every choice he refused to make, every conversation he refused to have, every truth he refused to face, every moment he chose the comfort of silence over the courage of honesty. The life he destroyed his family to obtain, he never lived for a single day. The clean slate he imagined, the fresh beginning he rehearsed, the version of himself he was so desperate to become, none of it materialized. Because the thing he needed most was never a new life. It was the willingness to live honestly inside the one he already had. Shanann Watts was 34 years old. She built a business from nothing, maintained a public platform while managing a chronic illness, loved her children with documented and visible intensity, and fought actively until the very end to save a marriage she did not know was already past saving. She deserved a partner who, when the walls closed in, chose honesty over performance. Bella Marie Watts was 4 years old. She recited a poem calling her father a hero. She fought for her life when it was taken from her. She deserved that mermaid birthday party. She deserved every year she was denied. Celeste Catherine Watts was 3 years old. She was funny, stubborn, and full of a personality that filled every room she entered. She deserved every single year ahead of her. Nico Lee Watts never drew a breath. He deserved the chance to. Chris Watts is currently incarcerated at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, serving 5 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. He will die inside those walls. And the silence he perfected across a lifetime of avoidance, The silence that constructed the cage and locked it from the inside is all he has left. He has spoken around the truth for 6 years. He has approached it and retreated from it, repackaged it, and performed it for different audiences in different rooms. And across all of that talking, the most revealing thing he has ever communicated is this: the truth was always too large for him to hold. Not because it was complicated, because delivering it completely and honestly would require a kind of courage he spent his entire life refusing to build. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico Watts deserved a husband and father who, when everything fell apart, chose truth instead of silence. They deserved to be here. They are not. And every word of what you just heard is the documented reason why. If this video gave you something, a deeper understanding of a case that has never been fully explained, a perspective that goes beyond the headlines, then this is exactly what True Crime Dav does on every single upload. Like this video, if it made you think differently about this case, subscribe to True Crime Dav so you never miss the next one, and drop a comment below. With your answer to this question, do you believe Chris Watts will ever deliver the full and honest truth, or has the silence already become permanent? We will see you in the next one.